and to empower the people to stand tall in dignity and integrity. But his revolutionary journey was cut short by betrayal, leaving his dream unfulfilled and his spirit to roam the land as an enduring symbol of resistance and hope. This book, The Ghost of Sankara, explores the life and legacy of Thomas Sankara. Through a blend of historical narrative, political analysis, and fictionalized encounters with the ghost of Sankara, this work aims to illuminate the impact of his ideas and the ongoing struggle for freedom and dignity in Africa and beyond. Chapter 1: The Rise of Sankara. 1.1 Early Life and Military Career. Thomas Sankara was born on December 21, 1949, in Yako, a small town in what was then the French colony of Upper Volta. His family belonged to the Mossi ethnic group, the largest in the region, with a deep history of resistance against French colonialism. The Mossi, known for their strong cultural identity and traditions, had maintained a semblance of autonomy even under colonial rule. This deep-rooted sense of identity and resilience would later influence Sankara's own philosophy of self-reliance and national pride. Growing up in a modest household, Sankara's early years were shaped by the experiences of his father, a veteran of the French colonial army. This connection to the colonial system provided Sankara with a unique perspective on the contradictions of colonial rule. His father's service in the colonial military, which brought both prestige and the realization of subjugation, left a lasting impression on Sankara. He was acutely aware of the disparity between the privileges of the colonial elite and the struggles of the common people, a realization that would later fuel his revolutionary zeal. During his formative years, Sankara was deeply influenced by the prevailing winds of change sweeping across Africa in the wake of decolonization. The 1950s and 1960s were marked by a wave of independence movements, as countries across the continent sought to free themselves from European rule. Leaders like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, and Algeria's Ahmed Ben Bella became icons of a new Africa, one that was determined to assert its sovereignty and chart its own course. This period of political upheaval and the aspirations for self-governance and dignity shaped Sankara's early worldview. At a young age, Sankara showed signs of intellectual curiosity and a deep sense of justice. His education began in missionary schools where he excelled in his studies, demonstrating a particular aptitude for critical thinking and leadership. The missionary environment, while providing a solid education, also exposed Sankara to the stark contradictions between Christian teachings of love and equality and the oppressive reality of colonial rule. These contradictions sparked in him a lifelong commitment to fighting for the rights of the oppressed and a disdain for the hypocrisy of those who preached equality while practicing domination. As Sankara progressed through his education, he became increasingly aware of the social injustices that plagued his country. He witnessed firsthand the poverty and exploitation that were rampant in Upper Volta, particularly in rural areas where colonial policies had entrenched inequality and underdevelopment. These early experiences sowed the seeds of Sankara's revolutionary ideas, instilling in him a profound desire to fight for the oppressed. Choosing to join the military was both a strategic and ideological decision for Sankara. In a country where opportunities for advancement were limited, the military offered a path to influence and power. But for Sankara, it was more than just a career. He viewed the military as a potential force for social change. His military training in Madagascar, where he studied at the Antsarab Academy, exposed him to Marxist and socialist ideologies, which were gaining traction among liberation movements across Africa. It was during this time that Sankara began to see the interconnectedness of African struggles and the need for a unified approach to overcoming the legacies of colonialism. In Madagascar, Sankara witnessed the Malagasy people's revolution against French rule, which deeply influenced his understanding of the potential for military forces to be a catalyst for national liberation. The Malagasy Revolution, which had overthrown a colonial puppet regime, served as a powerful example of what could be achieved when the military aligned itself with the people's aspirations for freedom and justice. Sankara also developed close relationships with other young African officers who shared his ideals, creating a network of like-minded individuals who would later support his revolutionary ambitions. Upon returning to Upper Volta, Sankara quickly rose through the ranks, earning a reputation as a disciplined, intelligent, and principled officer. His early postings, including stints in the northern regions of the country, exposed him to the harsh realities of rural poverty and the devastating effects of drought and desertification. These experiences further reinforced his commitment to addressing the root causes of poverty and underdevelopment. Sankara saw the military not just as a tool for defense, but as a vehicle for social transformation. He began to envision a new kind of leadership, one that was accountable to the people and committed to their well-being. 1.2 The path to power. By the early 1980s, Upper Volta was a nation in deep crisis. Decades of mismanagement, corruption, and reliance on foreign aid had left the country impoverished and politically unstable. The government, led by a series of ineffective and often corrupt leaders, failed to address the basic needs of its people. The economy was stagnant, with a majority of the population living in rural areas and relying on subsistence farming. The infrastructure was crumbling, education and healthcare were inadequate, and the country was heavily dependent on foreign aid to meet its most basic needs. The global context of the Cold War further complicated matters. Africa had become a battleground for the competing interests of the United States and the Soviet Union, with each superpower seeking to expand its influence on the continent. Many African governments were drawn into this geopolitical struggle, often at the expense of their own people. In Upper Volta, the ruling elite had aligned itself with Western powers, particularly France, which continued to exert significant influence over the country's political and economic affairs. Discontent was growing within Upper Volta, not just among the civilian population but also within the military ranks. The young officers, including Thomas Sankara, were increasingly frustrated with the country's direction. They saw the ruling elite as out of touch with the realities of the masses and overly dependent on Western powers. The government's failure to address the country's pressing problems, including widespread poverty, food insecurity, and unemployment, led to growing unrest. Protests and strikes became more frequent, and the calls for change grew louder. Sankara's rise to power was driven by a deep sense of responsibility and a burning desire to transform his country. His tenure as Prime Minister in 1983 under President Jean-Baptiste Udriogo was a pivotal moment. Sankara's radical policies and his outspoken criticism of the government's ties to the West quickly made him a popular figure among the people, but also a target for the entrenched powers who saw him as a threat. His appointment as Prime Minister was intended to appease the growing unrest, but it quickly became clear that Sankara had his own agenda. As Prime Minister, Sankara used his position to push for sweeping reforms, including measures to combat corruption, reduce government spending, and promote self-reliance. He spoke out against the reliance on foreign aid, which he saw as a form of neocolonialism, and he called for a more equitable distribution of resources. His speeches, delivered with passion and conviction, resonated with the people, who were desperate for change. Sankara's rhetoric was bold and uncompromising, reflecting his deep conviction that true independence could only be achieved through a complete break with the past. However, Sankara's policies and rhetoric also alarmed the conservative elements within the government, who saw him as a dangerous radical. They feared that his revolutionary ideas would destabilize the country and threaten their own power and privileges. Sankara's growing influence and popularity made him a target for those who wanted to maintain the status quo. It became clear that a confrontation was inevitable. Sankara's arrest in May 1983, orchestrated by conservative elements within the government, was intended to silence him. However, it had the opposite effect. His arrest galvanized his supporters, particularly within the military, who saw his detention as an affront to their own aspirations for change. The young officers who had come to see Sankara as a leader who represented their values and vision for the future were outraged. This moment of crisis became the catalyst for the revolution. The coup of August 4, 1983, was not just a seizure of power, it was the beginning of a radical transformation. Led by Sankara and his closest allies, including Blaise Compaoré, the coup was executed with precision and popular support. The coup was characterized by its relatively bloodless nature and its broad base of support among the military and civilian population. Sankara's rise to power was greeted with widespread enthusiasm, as people saw in him a leader who could finally deliver the change they had long been waiting for. Once in power, Sankara wasted no time in implementing his vision for Burkina Faso. His government was characterized by its commitment to a radical departure from the past. He immediately began dismantling the structures of corruption and dependency that had plagued the country. One of his first acts was to rename the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, symbolizing a new beginning. The name, meaning land of upright people, reflected Sankara's vision of a nation built on integrity, self-reliance, and dignity. The renaming was more than symbolic. It was a declaration of independence from the colonial past and a statement of the country's new direction. Sankara's leadership style was as innovative as his policies. He eschewed the trappings of power, opting for a simple lifestyle that mirrored the austerity he demanded of his government. He sold off the government's fleet of Mercedes-Benz cars, replacing them with a more modest Renault 5, the cheapest car available in Burkina Faso at the time. He reduced his own salary and encouraged government officials to do the same, emphasizing that leadership was about service, not personal enrichment. Sankara often wore the simple uniform of a soldier, a reflection of his belief that the government should be close to the people and that leaders should lead by example. Sankara's speeches during this period were a rallying cry for the people, urging them to take ownership of their future. He spoke passionately about the need to break free from the chains of neocolonialism, which he believed kept Africa in a state of perpetual dependency. His call to dare to invent the future resonated deeply with a population that had long been marginalized and oppressed. Sankara's message was one of empowerment, self-reliance, and dignity. He believed that the people of Burkina Faso had the capacity to transform the country and that the government's role was to provide the necessary tools and support. Chapter 2, Sankara's Revolution. 2.1 A new identity for Burkina Faso. Renaming the country was a foundational act in Sankara's revolution. Upper Volta was a name imposed by colonial powers, reflecting their disregard for the cultural and historical identities of the people who lived there. The name itself was a geographical reference to the Volta River, with no consideration for the diverse cultures and languages of the people. By changing the name to Burkina Faso, Sankara was not just rejecting colonial legacies. He was asserting the right of the Burkina people to define their own identity and future. The renaming was part of a broader strategy to decolonize the nation's consciousness. Sankara understood that true independence required more than political sovereignty. It required a fundamental shift in how people saw themselves and their place in the world. This shift was reflected in his policies, which sought to promote cultural pride, unity, and a new national consciousness. For Sankara, the renaming of the country was deeply personal. It was a reflection of his belief in the power of symbols to shape reality. He often spoke of the need for African nations to reclaim their identities from the remnants of colonial rule. In his view, the names, languages, and customs imposed by colonizers were not just remnants of the past, but active tools of subjugation that needed to be dismantled. Sankara's pride in his country's new identity was evident in his speeches and public appearances. He frequently used the term Burkinese, meaning upright people, to refer to his fellow citizens, emphasizing that the new name was not just a label, but a call to embody the values of dignity, integrity, and self-respect. Sankara believed that the name change was the first step in a larger process of national rebirth, one that would empower the people to take control of their own destiny. The cultural revolution that accompanied the renaming of Burkina Faso was multifaceted. Sankara introduced policies that promoted the use of local languages in schools and government, moving away from the exclusive use of French, the language of the former colonizers. This was a controversial move, as French had long been seen as a gateway to education and opportunity. However, Sankara argued that promoting local languages was essential for preserving cultural identity and making education more accessible to the rural population. He believed that language was a key component of cultural identity and that the use of local languages would help to bridge the gap between the government and the people. Sankara also encouraged the revival of traditional practices and arts, which had been suppressed or devalued under colonial rule. He saw this as essential to building a sense of national pride and continuity. Festivals celebrating traditional music, dance, and crafts were revitalized, and Sankara himself often participated in these events, reinforcing his connection with the people and his commitment to the cultural renaissance. The revival of traditional arts was not just about preserving the past. It was about creating a vibrant and dynamic culture that could adapt to the challenges of the modern world. Sankara's approach to cultural renewal was holistic, encompassing not just language and the arts, but also education, religion, and social norms. He sought to create an education system that was relevant to the needs of Burkina Faso, one that emphasized African history, culture, and values. He promoted the use of traditional medicine alongside modern healthcare, recognizing the importance of indigenous knowledge in addressing the country's health challenges. He also challenged social norms that he saw as oppressive, particularly those related to gender and family life. 2.2 Economic and social reforms. When Sankara came to power, Burkina Faso was one of the poorest countries in the world, with a weak economy heavily reliant on foreign aid. Sankara was acutely aware that this dependency was a continuation of the colonial relationship, with aid serving as a tool for maintaining control over the country's resources and policies. He famously said, "He who feeds you, controls you," encapsulating his belief that true independence could only be achieved through economic self-reliance. Sankara's approach to development was revolutionary in its focus on grassroots empowerment and sustainable, self-sufficient growth. He rejected the Western development models that emphasized industrialization and export-oriented agriculture, arguing that these approaches had failed to meet the needs of ordinary Africans. Instead, he prioritized policies that aimed to improve the living conditions of the poorest citizens, particularly in rural areas. Sankara's personal commitment to self-reliance was evident in his lifestyle and leadership style. He lived modestly, drove a simple car, and refused to accept personal gifts or bribes. This was not just symbolic. It was a direct challenge to the culture of corruption and excess that had become entrenched in many African governments. Sankara's personal integrity was a powerful tool in gaining the trust and support of the Burkina people, who saw in him a leader who genuinely cared about their well-being. Sankara's speeches during this period reflected his deep conviction that Africa's future lay in the hands of its own people, not in the policies and prescriptions of foreign powers. He frequently spoke about the need to produce what we consume, and consume what we produce, urging his fellow citizens to embrace local production and reduce reliance on imports. This call for self-reliance was not just about economic independence. It was about reclaiming control over the country's destiny. Sankara's economic policies focused on three key areas: land reform, industrialization, and social welfare. Land reform. Sankara initiated a sweeping land reform program aimed at redistributing land from the elite to the peasants who worked it. This was part of his broader strategy to boost agricultural production and achieve food self-sufficiency. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso saw a significant increase in food production, particularly in staple crops like millet and sorghum. Sankara encouraged the use of traditional farming methods and local seeds, which were more suited to the country's arid climate than the imported hybrid varieties that had been promoted by foreign aid programs. He believed that agricultural development was the foundation of national independence and that the country's future depended on the productivity and self-sufficiency of its farmers. Industrialization. Sankara sought to break Burkina Faso's reliance on imported goods by promoting local production and industrialization. He encouraged the development of small-scale industries that could produce basic goods like clothing, tools, and building materials. Sankara's government invested in infrastructure projects, including the construction of roads, dams, and irrigation systems, to support these industries and improve access to markets. This approach was innovative in its focus on building a self-sufficient economy from the ground up, rather than relying on large-scale, export-oriented industries. Sankara believed that industrialization should be driven by the needs of the people and that it should be sustainable and environmentally friendly. Social welfare. Sankara's social policies were aimed at improving the living conditions of the poorest citizens, particularly in rural areas. He launched ambitious programs to improve healthcare, education, and housing, often using innovative, low-cost methods. For example, Sankara's government built schools and clinics using local materials and labor, emphasizing community involvement in the construction process. This not only reduced costs but also fostered a sense of ownership and pride among the people. Sankara's emphasis on preventive health care, including vaccination campaigns and public health education, led to significant improvements in health outcomes, particularly in reducing infant mortality and combating diseases like malaria and measles. Sankara believed that social development was the key to national progress and that the government's primary responsibility was to ensure the well-being of all its citizens. Chapter 3, The Betrayal. 3.1 Enemies Within and Without. Sankara's bold and uncompromising policies quickly earned him many enemies. His rejection of foreign aid and his nationalization efforts threatened the interests of powerful international corporations and Western governments. Domestically, his radical reforms disrupted the traditional power structures, alienating the elite, landowners, and even some within his own military. The powerful class of landowners and merchants, who had long benefited from the status quo, were particularly threatened by Sankara's policies, which aimed to redistribute wealth and resources more equitably across the population. These elites, who had enjoyed close ties with the former colonial administration and Western businesses, saw Sankara's policies as a direct threat to their interests and livelihoods. Internationally, Sankara's staunch anti-imperialism and his vocal criticism of the global economic order made him a target for Western governments, particularly France and the United States. His decision to nationalize key industries, including land and natural resources, and his call for African countries to repudiate their foreign debts were seen as provocative challenges to the Western-dominated global system. Sankara's speech at the Organization of African Unity, (OAU) summit in 1987, where he called for a united front against the repayment of unjust debts, further alienated him from the West. In this speech, Sankara argued that the debts were a continuation of colonial exploitation and that repaying them would only perpetuate the poverty and dependency of African nations. As Sankara's popularity grew among the masses, so did the conspiracies against him. Blaise Compaoré, once Sankara's closest ally and friend, began to distance himself, aligning with factions both within and outside the country that were opposed to Sankara's policies. Compaoré, who had been instrumental in the 1983 coup that brought Sankara to power, began to question Sankara's uncompromising stance and his increasing isolation on the international stage. Compaoré's growing disillusionment was fueled by both personal ambition and pressure from external actors who viewed Sankara as a destabilizing force in the region. The global political environment of the Cold War, with its complex web of alliances and covert operations, further exacerbated the situation. Sankara's outspoken criticism of neocolonialism and his alignment with other revolutionary movements around the world made him a target for those who viewed his leadership as a threat to their interests. The French government, which had long maintained close ties with its former colonies in Africa, saw Sankara's policies as a challenge to its influence in the region. France's fear of losing control over its former colonies, coupled with its economic interests in Burkina Faso's natural resources, made it increasingly hostile to Sankara's regime. Sankara was aware of the dangers he faced. In his later speeches, there was a clear sense of foreboding as he spoke about the possibility of betrayal. He warned his followers that revolutionaries should not fear death, and that the fight for justice and dignity would continue even after his passing. Sankara's deep sense of duty to his people, combined with his understanding of the risks involved in challenging powerful interests, made his determination all the more remarkable. He understood that his radical vision for Burkina Faso and Africa would not be achieved without significant resistance, both from within and outside the country. Despite the mounting threats, Sankara remained resolute in his commitment to his ideals. He continued to push forward with his reforms, even as the forces aligned against him grew stronger. Sankara believed that the revolution he had begun was bigger than any individual and that it was the responsibility of the people to carry it forward. He frequently spoke of the need for vigilance and unity in the face of external and internal threats, urging the people to stay committed to the principles of the revolution. 3.2 The coup of 1987. On October 15, 1987, Thomas Sankara was assassinated in a coup orchestrated by Blaise Compaoré and supported by elements within the military. The coup was swift and brutal, leaving no room for resistance. Sankara was shot and killed along with 12 of his comrades during a meeting at the Council of the Entente, the government headquarters in Ouagadougou. The assassination was meticulously planned, with the conspirators ensuring that Sankara's supporters were either neutralized or too isolated to mount an effective response. The immediate aftermath of the coup saw the dismantling of many of Sankara's reforms. Compaoré, who took over as president, quickly moved to reverse the policies that had defined Sankara's revolutionary government. He re-established ties with Western powers and international financial institutions, reversing the nationalizations and opening up the country to foreign investment. The ideals of self-reliance, dignity, and social justice that Sankara had championed were quickly abandoned in favor of a more conventional, pro-Western approach. Compaoré justified these changes by arguing that Burkina Faso needed to stabilize its economy and reintegrate into the international community, but for many, it was clear that the coup had been a betrayal of Sankara's vision. The assassination of Thomas Sankara sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso and beyond. For many Burkinabes, it was not just the loss of a leader, but the betrayal of a dream. Sankara had embodied their hopes for a better future, and his death was a devastating blow. Yet, even in death, Sankara's influence endured. His speeches, his policies, and his vision for Burkina Faso continued to inspire those who believed in the possibility of a more just and equitable world. The memory of Sankara became a rallying point for those who opposed Compaoré's regime, and his image became a symbol of resistance against oppression and exploitation. In the years following the coup, Compaoré's government sought to erase Sankara's legacy from public memory. References to Sankara were removed from official records, and his policies were systematically dismantled. However, efforts to suppress his legacy only strengthened the resolve of those who saw him as a martyr for the cause of African liberation. Sankara's ideas continued to circulate, both within Burkina Faso and across the continent, as a reminder of what could have been and a call to continue the struggle for a just and independent Africa. Internationally, the reaction to Sankara's assassination was mixed. While progressive movements and revolutionary leaders mourned his death and condemned the coup, many Western governments remained silent or offered only muted criticism. France, which had long been wary of Sankara's policies, expressed little concern over his death, viewing Compaoré as a more reliable ally in the region. The United States, focused on its Cold War agenda, also showed little interest in Sankara's demise, preferring stability over the potential for revolutionary upheaval. The coup and the subsequent reversal of Sankara's reforms marked a turning point in Burkina Faso's history. The country, which had been on a path to self-reliance and social justice under Sankara's leadership, was once again plunged into a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment. The progress that had been made in education, healthcare, and infrastructure began to unravel, and the hopes of the Burkina people were dashed. Yet, even in this dark period, the spirit of Sankara remained alive, inspiring new generations to take up the mantle of his unfinished revolution. Chapter 4, The Ghost of Sankara. 4.1 A legacy lives on. Despite his untimely death, Thomas Sankara's ideas have continued to resonate across Africa and the world. His vision of a self-reliant, just, and dignified Africa has inspired subsequent generations of activists, politicians, and thinkers. In many ways, Sankara's legacy has grown even stronger in death, as he has become a symbol of resistance against oppression and a martyr for the cause of African liberation. Sankara's influence can be seen in the rise of new social movements across the continent, from the anti-austerity protests in West Africa to the youth-led uprisings in North Africa and the environmental activism in Southern Africa. His ideas have also found resonance in global movements for social justice, environmental sustainability, and anti-imperialism. For those who knew him, Sankara's legacy is a constant reminder of what could have been. His former comrades, many of whom were also targets of the coup, have continued to fight for the ideals he championed. For younger generations, Sankara represents a model of leadership that is both visionary and grounded in the realities of ordinary people's lives. His speeches, his policies, and his personal example continue to inspire those who seek to challenge the status quo and build a more just and equitable world. The concept of the ghost in African political culture is a powerful one. In many African societies, the spirits of the dead are believed to influence the living, particularly those who held power in life. The idea of the ghost of Sankara reflects this cultural belief, as well as the moral reckoning faced by those who betrayed him and continue to oppress the people. Sankara's assassination left a deep wound in the collective consciousness of Burkina Faso. For many, the betrayal of Sankara was not just a political act, but a moral and spiritual transgression. The ghost of Sankara represents the unfinished business of the revolution and the ongoing struggle for justice and dignity in Burkina Faso and beyond. Sankara's spirit, in this sense, serves as a moral compass, reminding the people of what was lost and what still needs to be achieved. For those who continue to fight for the ideals Sankara championed, his ghost is a source of inspiration and strength. 4.2 Sankara's vision for the future. In the years since Sankara's assassination, Africa has faced a series of challenges, from political instability and economic crises to environmental degradation and social inequality. Yet, in the midst of these challenges, there has also been a resurgence of interest in Sankara's ideas, particularly among young people who are seeking alternatives to the status quo. Movements for democracy, social justice, and environmental sustainability have drawn inspiration from Sankara's vision of a self-reliant, just, and dignified Africa. These movements have often been led by young people who see in Sankara a model of leadership that is both visionary and grounded in the realities of ordinary people's lives. For those who seek to reclaim Sankara's ideals, the challenge is not just to remember the past, but to apply his ideas in new and innovative ways. Sankara's vision was rooted in the specific context of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, but the principles he championed, self-reliance, social justice, and dignity, are timeless and universal. The task of reclaiming Sankara's ideals is therefore not just a matter of looking back, but of looking forward and imagining what those ideals might look like in the 21st century. The fight for justice, dignity, and self-reliance is not just a historical struggle. It is an ongoing one. The world has changed since Sankara's time, but the fundamental issues he addressed, poverty, inequality, exploitation, and oppression, remain as relevant as ever. As new generations take up the mantle of leadership, the challenge is to build on the foundation that Sankara laid, while also adapting to the changing realities of the globalized world. This requires not just a commitment to the ideals of the past, but a willingness to innovate and experiment, to take risks and learn from mistakes, and to remain steadfast in the pursuit of justice and dignity for all. Epilogue: Sankara's eternal vigil. The ongoing relevance of Sankara's ideas in today's global struggles, particularly in the context of rising authoritarianism, economic inequality, and environmental degradation, highlights the enduring power of his legacy. As long as these issues remain unresolved, the spirit of Sankara will continue to inspire those who fight for justice and dignity. Sankara's vigil is not just a ghostly presence. It is a living force that continues to guide and inspire. For those who continue to fight for the ideals he championed, Sankara's spirit is a source of strength and hope, a reminder that the struggle for a better world is worth fighting for, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Ghost of Sankara is not just a story about a revolutionary leader who transformed his country and inspired a continent. It is a story about the power of ideas, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ongoing struggle for justice and dignity in a world that continues to be shaped by the legacies of colonialism, exploitation, and oppression. Through the life and legacy of Thomas Sankara, this book seeks to remind readers that the fight for a better world is not just a historical struggle, but an ongoing one.